Shove it, man!
I've been toying with making this video for the last 2 years, and I admit I was a coward because I was worried about the consequences. I also misjudged the Shove It squad. You guys are mature enough to accept that not everyone has to have the same opinion in wrestling, and that's okay. If I never reach Graceland, that's also okay, because I'm happy. I'm happy as long as I continue to have a mature audience who I can make honest content for without having to pander to someone. So on that point, you're going to all need to reach for your bricks about now. What I'm going to tell you all might hurt. I've been sitting on this for 2 years and I need to come clean, and I'm going to be brave here. I don't hate Vince Russo. Never have. In fact, I kind of miss him not being involved with wrestling anymore. I get it, okay? I'm British. That means everything has to be woke, socially acceptable and conforming. Well, shut up or I'll smack you one. Most of my audience is from the US anyway. No one around here watches me anyway because I don't stick to the woke British agenda. I hate it. I'll say what I want to say. Why are we all letting a bunch of goons dictate our opinions? I get it, this has been going on for years now. Some of you were raised on the opinions of twat culture and WrestleGoonia. Well, we aren't all like them. Just because they say something doesn't make it correct. There's a different side to every story. Why are we letting these kinds of people shape our ideas anyway? I say no more. The main target of these channels for the last decade or whatever has been Vince Russo. They absolutely hate him and everything he stands for, and you should too, because a virgin covered in acne pus from his morning bacon grease bath told you to. Is that something you all want to look up to? It's time for a different perspective. I will just say I'm not in any way saying Russo is an amazing human being or something. I mean, he's definitely a liar. I have no doubts about that. But put that to the side for now. I actually like what some of you might call garbage wrestling. I think Russo called it Crash TV. There's an audience for this stuff, you know. What do you think happened to all the wrestling fans who no longer watch? On a side note, I'm sorry for misjudging the Shove It squad. You guys can handle a different opinion and I'm certainly about to give you one. Looks like my full-time YouTube gig is about to end before it barely started. Here are 10 things I liked about Vince Russo's time in wrestling. Promos, on-screen personality. When Vince Russo talked, you all sat up and listened whether you liked what he had to say or not. He seems to have got this reputation for shoot promos where he would name drop any wrestler he wanted and cuss them out and drop the F-bomb. If you put everything you know about Russo to the side and forget and watch one of his promos now, I guarantee it'll be one of the most interesting promos on the show. Now that might be hard to accept because he's not an actual wrestler, but he can talk better than most of them. Maybe him being an on-screen character in WCW was a bad choice, but in TNA, yeah, why not? They were a new company and needed strong characters who made you pay attention to the new company. He never botched or stumbled over his words, and everything he said was said with conviction. In TNA, it felt like his promo stirred some people up so much to the point that a real fight could take place at any moment. Roddy Piper, anyone. Come on, Mike today's not going to smack him, is he? I would mark him down for his constant use of insider terms and discussing real issues and shoots, but it seems to be the cool thing to do nowadays. So for the simple fact that his promos made you pay attention, I'll praise him for that. No one ever called his promos boring. His shoot interviews since, well, that's another story, bro. Thick-skinned. I'm sometimes surprised that Vince Russo is still around doing interviews with literally anybody who asks him to. He has to be the most available guy in the wrestling business. Seriously, shoot him a message, I'm sure you could interview him. But from doing all these interviews, it's opened him up to a lot of abuse. I often wonder if he just kept quiet, would people view him differently today? Ultimately, lots of the abuse leads back to Jim Cornette. For some reason, Jim Cornette's words are taken as gospel, despite Russo being the one who has achieved more in wrestling. This is something else I blame on early wrestling YouTube channels. You know, there's two sides to every story. Why hasn't Cornette got any stories about his stupid mistakes in wrestling? I'm sure he made some, nobody's perfect. Or is it just because Cornette is a much more likeable person? Other than that, I think his other main source of hatred is from the death of Owen Hart. Owen died on Russo's watch doing a zip line to the ring and tragically falling to his death on pay-per-view. Russo would take much of the hit from this from fans and wrestlers alike. Russo would have had death threats over this, and he's still blamed to this day for Owen's death. It's crazy that Russo was able to carry on working through all of that abuse. I don't want to talk too much about the Owen Hart stuff because I know it's a very sensitive subject. But what I will say is that it was Owen's choice to go along with the stunt. It was a stunt he'd even done a couple of times before he fell. Ultimately, someone's got to take the blame, but why not Vince McMahon? It's clear that Russo's ideas were constantly filtered, we hear it all the time, so why wasn't this one? This is in no way me trying to garner sympathy for Russo. What I do say is fair play for him carrying on working hard through the torrents of abuse he's had over the years. I get the occasional death threat myself, but that's what it is, occasional. Imagine the stress and abuse Russo's been put through over the years. Russo certainly needed to be thick-skinned for everything he's been put through, and I can respect that. I'm even guilty of it myself. The stars he pushed. I pretty much love all the stars of the Attitude Era, but just like any bookers of wrestling past, Russo certainly had his favourites. In the WWF, Test and D'Lo Brown were two of my favourites as a kid, and it just so turned out that Russo was a big fan of theirs. I'm not claiming either were incredible, in fact, they were the perfect mid-carders. He also loved Mick Foley, Chyna, Edge and Christian, and Steve Austin, so he would have made sure they were given a prominent spot on the show. And over in WCW, Russo was a massive fan of Booker T, and he helped him to become a main event player, winning the main belt 5 times. Over in TNA, Russo loved AJ Styles, AMW, The Pope, and most importantly, Kurt Angle. If another writer had been in charge, things could have turned out differently for some of these wrestlers. The comedy. With Russo as head writer, we got to see some comedy injected into our wrestling. It was often hit or miss. I mean, in the WWF, we got to see Kaientai chopping off Val Venus's penis, and we also got to see Mark Henry in love with a transsexual woman. At least it was memorable. But in TNA, it felt like the fine-tuning was completed, and between 2007 and 2009, the shows were a laugh a minute. It's comedy that still holds up today, even in today's woke society. It's fine, because it's belittling men. You can't make jokes about anyone else, though. Now, I'm not saying Russo was the comedic genius who came up with all this stuff. Russo has even credited Jeremy Borash with some of it, but it all happened on Russo's watch. Some people might find it too much comedy, but everyone's different. At least these shows got some emotion out of me. Normally I stare at a wrestling show with a blank expression waiting for it to end with a brick in my hand. TNA as a whole. For those of you who don't know, I'm kind of the TNA guy on YouTube. I love to shit on them, but I also love to praise them. One thing I will say about TNA is up to about 2014, it was never boring. I watch wrestling to be entertained, whether that be good or bad stuff. TNA had its fair share of both, so it's right up my alley. Vince Russo was the head writer on and off for their highest points, and TNA was the second biggest wrestling promotion in the US. Now you can debate until the cows come home over who booked some of the most ridiculous TNA matches. Reverse battle royals, blindfold matches, electric cage matches, but were any of those matches boring? No. They were terrible in a wrestling purist eyes, but there's a reason that channels like mine exist. People want to hear about these ridiculous matches and be entertained. I won't bang on about TNA too much because I do that enough, but I'll leave you with this. Most people, no matter how much they hate TNA, can accept that between 2007 and 2009, TNA had their best run. And who was working there then? Vince Russo. Shows he booked were never boring. No matter how bad the shows were that Russo was the booker, no one can really say they were boring. There may have been some boring matches with wrestlers who had zero personality, but it would straight away be followed up by a shit crazy shoot promo or a crazy segment of Ric Flair dumping on Mike Sanders' face. And whilst that last one didn't actually happen, things in WCW often did get that crazy. I get comments all the time saying that Russo's period in WCW is still more entertaining than current wrestling. TNA was also never boring. It was often so bad that it was funny, and that's better than boring. Try something different. Vince Russo was a writer who wasn't afraid to take chances and try something different. Did it always work? No, definitely not. Take the Brawl for All, for example. He was trying to give jobbers an opportunity in real 3-round fights, and he also wanted JBL to get beaten up. And whilst it was terrible, at least he tried. Nothing will ever change if you don't try and take chances and try something different. If only current wrestling companies would have had the balls to try and do something new and different. They're all pretty much the same nowadays with just a different banner. I'd love a wrestling company to hire Russo in 2022, if only to give us something different. I bet everyone would tune in just because it's Russo for the first time in years. By the way, it's no coincidence that Russo liked Lucha Underground, because they were the only company trying to be different. I've got a sneaking suspicion he'd like MLW too. WCW was actually better when he took over the second time. I'm talking about when he came back with Eric Bischoff in the year 2000 here. At this point, I don't think anyone could have really saved WCW. All their top stars were on insane contracts with insane egos, and Hogan even had creative control. There's barely any young guys in a position to take over the reins of the main event scene, so Bischoff and Hogan start the New Blood vs Millionaire Club angle. The thing didn't work out great in the end, but the point was to elevate some of the younger guys in the New Blood. Something WCW desperately needed to do. They also tried to push the Natural Born Thrillers, another collection of young guys who didn't have much personality, unfortunately. Lance Storm received the biggest push of his career. Booker T in the main events, and Scott Steiner finally got to work at the top of the card doing his Roid Rage gimmick. People like to dump on WCW for not producing any stars. That's hardly Russo's fault. He wasn't there long enough to do that. It's not something that happens overnight, you know. Now on to the bad stuff. David Arquette and Vince himself both held the heavyweight title. Shoot promos that wouldn't have made much sense to a casual fan at the time. Confusing matches and weird booking. Don't get me wrong, I don't think Russo's time in WCW was good. But also I think it's unfair to blame him for the death of WCW. WCW was already dying when he arrived. He merely accelerated the death. They hadn't built any new stars and a bunch of guys in their late 40s were earning millions. The blame has to lie with Bischoff. I find it astounding how little blame he receives as the boss when Russo was there for just less than 2 years overall. Somebody hit him with a brick. I'm about to be sick. The Attitude Era. Judging by my age demographic that watch my videos, most of you like me grew up during the Attitude Era, a time when wrestling ratings were insane. Back in 1999, you could ask a random person on the street about Raw last night and they could tell you what happened. Wrestling was mainstream, it wasn't just for people on the internet. Vince Russo was a large part of the success that the WWF experienced in the late 90s. He was employed as the head writer between 97 and late 99, and he oversaw WWF catching up and eventually beating their WCW competition. He changed the show a lot. He made it a lot edgier, a lot sexier, and a lot more violent, and this would be known as Crash TV. Now, I'm in no way saying Russo was responsible for all of that success. You've all heard the stories that for every great idea Russo had, there'd be 10 bad ideas. His ideas would be picked through carefully, and mostly only the best made it onto TV. But at least he had fucking ideas. Tell that to the current wrestling writers. I don't think half the things he wrote would be deemed acceptable nowadays anyway, especially in the super woke UK. But it was a different time, for God's sake. We need to stop cringing and dumping on things that were happening in 1998. It was a different world back then. Russo would have a hand in things such as the rise of Stone Cold and The Rock, the Mick Foley This Is Your Life segment, and the amazing factions that went on. People are quick to write Russo off, but he was the head writer, so you can't really claim he had nothing to do with those things. He was in charge, and other than Vince McMahon, he was in charge of the storylines. So for his contributions to the best time in wrestling, I thank Vince Russo. A show for adults. Okay, maybe slightly immature adults. I'll make this one short because it's pretty easy to understand. Russo was a big fan of the ECW style in the late 90s, so he emulated it as best he could with TV restrictions often getting in his way. When he took over, the WWF was full of childish gimmicks, with constantly fighting a battle of good versus evil. Russo gave the show some attitude. Yes, a lot of the stuff that happened would not be acceptable today. Who cares, it was good. There's a reason a lot of people have no interest in modern wrestling, and all they do is continuously watch old stuff. So the WWF got blood, violence, tits and ass every night, drug references and cool characters. It's almost like Russo realised these were things that adults were actually interested in. By making the show more adult, they crushed their WCW competition. When Russo jumped over to WCW, he'd have a problem. The Turner Network would not allow WCW to push the envelope as much as the WWF did in the Attitude department. Russo wanted to get around that by signing as many ECW guys as he could, as whatever they did, no one could say these guys were appealing to children. He also set about trying to elevate the mid-card guys to create some new stars. We also got some shoot promos which were more appealing to an older demographic who were learning more and more about wrestling from the internet as days went by, whether that be good or a bad thing. Russo moved to be the writer for TNA and he did this on and off for the next 12 years. Under his guidance, the show would pretty much go the same way the WWF did during the Attitude Era. Lots of blood, guts, swearing, adult comedy and nudity. I never associated TNA as a show for children. The only modern show for real adults nowadays is MLW, and to a lesser extent AEW. AEW doesn't quite know who it's appealing to. They have blood and violence and shoot promos, followed by Orange Cassidy and Tracy Beaker. Make a decision and stick to it, for God's sake. Giving everyone a storyline. This is a fact that many in the industry have backed up. Russo had no problem finding something for people to do. Vince Russo is the king of storyline-driven wrestling. People say there's storylines in wrestling now, but I'd say barely. Most storylines don't go further than two people wanting to fight for a belt. It's so low-key you barely notice it happening. So he made sure that all the wrestlers on his stacked roster had something in the bag to do. It might have just been something small, like a young Edge and Christian feuding with the young Hardys over the services of Terry Runnels. It could have been screaming Norman Smiley with his hardcore belt. Or it could have been Sanjay Dutt in the Paparazzi Productions being the butt of all jokes. But at least everyone was on TV in some way. Nowadays with wrestling, if you miss a show for 1 week, you'll have no idea who half the wrestlers are on the show the next week. The rosters are so bloated and lots of the wrestlers only feature on the shows twice a month. Russo's other method of giving everyone a role was to have wrestling factions. He loved a good faction. This one would have mixed results, but again, at least it meant that, I don't know, the fucking Truth Commission had a chance to go on TV most weeks. Can't see those guys getting on TV any other way. So yeah, I massively miss this style in wrestling. They used to say professional wrestling was a soap opera with wrestling included. Now it's just a bunch of guys who would be better suited to being in an actual soap opera. No one could call Vince Russo's storylines boring. So that's it. I get that this video isn't going to be for everyone, and there are going to be some of you who will never be able to stop hating Russo. And I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking that you realise that he wasn't as bad as the internet wrestling world will have you believe. My honest opinion is that Vince Russo with some people around him to filter out his bad ideas would be an asset to companies. I doubt that will ever happen though, because his name's been dragged so far through the dirt at this point that no one would ever give him an opportunity in wrestling again. Each year Vince seems to suggest he's offered his help to the WWE and other companies. I think he's yelling in the wind, to be honest. Vince, you've taken so much abuse and hatred over the years, maybe it's right that you just fade away. But I'll never hate you, and I can respect that there were positives to your time in wrestling. So that's it, it's over. Now you can all yell at me. I'm not going to end this video on a threat, because it's not like you guys need any more encouragement after hearing this video. Fuck me, lad, you're going to regret making this one. Yeah, probably.